Every investigation begins the same way. A name, a file, a story waiting to be told. But every file begins with a life. I'm Rietta, and this is the Black File Project. File 001, Chapter 3, The Cost of Choices. Let's open the file. Last episode, we went through a bunch of the case files, all sorts of divorce filings, protective orders, sheriff reports, all sorts of things that were happening every few months. And I remember thinking when I originally started digging into this case, surely things have to kind of settle down after a little while. You know, things are going to start moving forward. Instead, I turned the page and there was another court order, and another, and another. And by this point, I wasn't reading isolated documents anymore. I was watching situations and lives unfold one document at a time. And this next document is no less concerning, to say the least, than some of the ones we covered in the last episode. So on October 9th, 2009, there was a consent order. This order wasn't about Andy or Mendy this time. This one involves Heather and her son. By now, Andy and Heather were in a relationship, and according to this agreement, Heather and Philip had reached a custody arrangement for their son. On the surface, it looks like a custody modification. Parents do this all the time. But then you start reading the details, and that's when things get interesting. Heather agreed that primary custody of their son would be transferred to Philip. She also agreed to pay child support. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because it's really easy to read one sentence like that and move on. But let's really think about what that actually means. Their son wasn't just a name in a court file. That's Heather's little boy. And every custody order represents a family trying to figure out what life looks like next after they go their separate ways, but they're never completely separate. And sometimes those decisions are made willingly, and sometimes they aren't. But they're never just words on paper. Those are real people. We're real parents, real children. But then the next paragraph is what's a little different, I think, than your usual order. The next paragraph really got me to stop for a second, because the agreement says that Andy was to have no contact with Heather's son. Not limited contact, not supervised visitation, no contact. The order goes on to say that if Andy completed anger management courses, then contact could begin, but only under supervision. I'm going to say that again. If Andy completed anger management, then he could have supervised visits. I'm just reading that again because I read it twice. That wasn't a suggestion, and it wasn't, oh, this is temporary. It was part of the agreement that he would have no contact. The other part, it didn't stop there. The final part of it says that Heather could lose custody if she violated that order. She was also meant to respect this order. The document also says something else, that Heather acknowledged that she couldn't control Andy's actions, but she agreed that she would be responsible for following the terms of the order. Meaning, if Andy had contact with her son outside of those conditions, Heather risked losing custody completely. And I can't imagine the position that would put her in. Think about where Heather was in her life. She was building a new future with Andy, according to the marriage license. And for those watching me visually, you see that I put marriage license in quotes. We'll get to that later because that's another interesting thing. The two would marry just a few months later on May 2nd of 2010. New agreement, still got married. But put yourself into Heather's shoes just for a moment. You're planning a wedding, you're trying to build a new family, but at the same time, in the background, you're signing an agreement that says this man you're about to marry cannot, under any circumstances, have contact with your son unless very specific conditions are met. Whether you agree with that order or not, it's impossible to ignore how complicated that made Heather's life. And then the order adds one more detail. It specifically describes Heather and Andy as being in a romantic relationship. It also repeats an earlier restriction that there was to be no overnight guests unrelated by blood or marriage or anyone of romantic interest. Knowing that this is a soon-to-be husband and wife. It's impossible not to realize how quickly life changes. Because they were already in a romantic relationship. No overnight guest of anyone in a romantic relationship. This is before they're married. Sometimes when we tell stories like this, it's tempting to skip ahead, to get back to the mystery, and to get to 2017. Because, that's the thing that people are really interested, right? But if we do that, we'd miss moments like this. Moments that maybe necessarily didn't make the headline or even the investigations or maybe even theories of what's going on. It was about a mother, her little boy, a new relationship, and decisions that would shape everything that came after. So we're moving on now from October of 2009. Again, I'm like, okay, maybe this will start to settle. Heather and Andy were married in May of 2010, like I said earlier. Maybe now that the wedding has happened, everybody can really move forward. And court battles can be done. We can all just try to be happily cohesive. One of the things this researching this case has really taught me is that sometimes the most important parts of a court order isn't what it says, it's what it means. Because judges aren't just writing these court orders willy-nilly, right? They're responding to information that has been presented to them. Sometimes that's testimony, sometimes that's evidence, and sometimes it's just an agreement between parties. Whatever led to this order, it ended with another major change in Heather's son's life. And according to the order entered in July of 2010, Philip was awarded sole custody of their son. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second. Less than a year earlier, Heather had agreed to transfer custody. Now the court was making Philip the sole custodial parent. Those are two very different things. And then as I kept reading, I came across another section that was interesting. The order states that Heather's son had suffered mistreatment while in Heather's care. Now, I want to be careful here. The order doesn't spend pages explaining every detail that led to that finding. What it tells us is the court's conclusion. It also notes Heather explained bruising on her son by saying it happened while her son and Heather were play fighting or roughhousing. Those are Heather's reported statements as reflected in the order. That's it. That's what the document says. Nothing more, nothing less. When I read that, I couldn't help but think back to the agreement we talked about just a few minutes ago. The one that prohibited Andy from having contact with Heather's son unless certain conditions were met. Now here we are, not much later, reading another court document involving that same child, and I'm not asking you to connect dots that aren't there. I'm simply showing you why these documents matter and the series of events that unfolded. And there's still another paragraph. The court found Heather in contempt. The reason? According to the order, she had allowed an overnight guest who was unrelated by blood or marriage. I bet you can take a guess who the guest was. It was Andy. And remember, this restriction wasn't new. The earlier custody agreement had specifically addressed overnight guests. Now the court is saying that that order was violated. I did find myself wondering what Heather must have been thinking during all this. Not as an investigation, just as a person, just like you and me. She had fallen in love. She'd gotten married. She's trying to build a future. At the same time, she's navigating these custody hearings and court orders. And now she's been found in contempt. Whatever hopes she had when she married Andy, life clearly wasn't getting simpler. It was getting more complicated. And I don't think she was the sole reason that the boundaries were pushed. One of the hardest parts of researching a case like this, when we know how the story ends already, it's easy to look backwards and judge every decision. But real life doesn't work like that. Heather didn't know what the next 7 years were going to bring. She wasn't living inside a true crime documentary. She was just living her life, making decisions, trying to make a relationship work, still trying to raise her son. And that's something I never want us to lose sight of. Because before she became the center of all of this, she was just trying to live out her life like the rest of us. So now we move on to yet another document. Surprise, surprise. Only this time, it was not a custody order. It was a criminal investigation. And this one would bring in Detective Hurd. So according to Detective Hurd's affidavit, Andy contacted the Dallas Police Department and reported that Mendy had been abusing their children. As part of that report, he provided an email that he said supported his allegations. At first glance, that might not sound so unusual. If someone believes a child is being abused, you would expect law enforcement to investigate. And that's exactly what happened. Detective Hurd did investigate. But as the investigation continued, the focus shifted. According to the affidavit, Detective Hurd obtained the original email and compared it to the version that had been provided. The detective concluded that the threatening language appearing in the version he received had not been part of the original email and alleged that it had been added before it was forwarded to law enforcement. That's an important distinction. So the threatening language was added before it was sent to law enforcement. And this is documented by Detective Hurd. As a result of that investigation, criminal charges were pursued against Andy, not Mendy. And it was for a false report of a crime. More than a year later, the Paulding County District Attorney formally accused Andy of making a false report of a crime involving allegations of child abuse. Now, I also want to tell you what happened next because this is important. In February of 2014, those charges were dismissed. According to the filing, the state concluded that in light of new information, it did not believe it could meet its burden of proof at trial. That doesn't mean the original investigation never happened. It doesn't mean the accusation never existed. It means the case did not proceed to trial. And I do think that's an important distinction, and it's important that we include both parts of that story because that's what the records show. I'm not just showing you things with one sole purpose. The more I read into this case and the more I study cases in general and I research, the more I find out that very few stories fit into neatly into one box. Accusations are made, they're investigated, sometimes charges are filed, sometimes they're dismissed. If we're going to walk through this file honestly, we have to be willing to tell all parts of the story, not just the ones that support one side or the other. But yet again, that was not the end of the legal disputes. In late 2013, Andy petitioned the court for a protective order on behalf of his 3 sons, alleging physical and sexual abuse at Mendy's home. Now, those are serious allegations. The court considered the petition, but less than 2 weeks later, the petition was dismissed for lack of evidence. Whether we agree with this outcome or not, that's where the public court records leave us. Now we are going to take a little jump, and things are going to change a little. We're going to go away from some court records, but that doesn't mean it's going to be any less interesting. So it's now 2015. At this point, we've spent years inside courtrooms with all sorts of different types of reports, allegations, you name it. It's been pretty personal and pretty private for the most part, unless people were close to either Andy or Heather. But things suddenly are about to get very public. And it started with some newspaper articles. And when I originally started going through the file, when Mary shared it with me, I remember thinking, why is there a country music festival in here? And what does this have to do with Heather? And I'm sure now that I've said that, you're probably thinking the same thing. And the answer, at least at first, wasn't obvious. But when you start reading, it still goes in to the pattern of what has been happening over the last several years that we've covered. So the first article is from March 18th of 2015. This is a very optimistic article. It talks about a brand new event titled the Chattahoochee River Country Music Festival. According to the article, organizers believe this wasn't just going to be another weekend concert. It was supposed to be one of the biggest country music festivals Georgia had ever seen. The projections were enormous. More than 120,000 people were expected over 3 days. There would be camping, fishing, kayaking, a 10-day carnival, major country music artist. And reading this article, it almost still felt contagious. You could feel the excitement. Communities were preparing, businesses were preparing, people were buying tickets, and from everything being reported, it sounded like a huge opportunity for the area. According to the article, Andy Turner and Jason Benson, through their company Celeb Scene, were helping to organize this event. Months of planning had already gone into it. People were investing money. Sponsors were signing contracts. Vendors were committing. And there were even hotels that were signing contracts and preparing for visitors. Nobody could have predicted what was going to happen a few months later. So the next article, it didn't even feel close to the same. The excitement and the positivity had completely shifted. And now the headlines were talking about unpaid vendors, criminal investigation, and lawsuits. So according to reporting done by Georgia Unfiltered, the festival was moved from its original location to the VFW complex in Carrollton. Honestly, not sure how to say that. Tickets that had originally been sold from between $89 to $1,000 were being given away for free. The 10-day carnival ended early because, according to the carnival company, it had not been paid. And local hotel owners reported unpaid bills. And the Carrollton Police confirmed they were investigating complaints from vendors who believed they had been defrauded. Then I found an article from Fox 5. So where we went from kind of a smaller newspaper to one of the big guys. And Fox didn't just report that the festival struggled. They actually interviewed the people that were involved. And according to Fox 5 promoter Ken Nettles, he said the original vision was for this massive 3-day festival where people could camp on site. The investigation also reported that promotional materials represented that Alan Jackson was coming and was under contract when he was not. During the interview, Andy acknowledged that Andy Jackson had never been signed and described earlier wording suggested otherwise as inaccurate. Fox also reported that attendance reached only a few thousand people rather than the projected volume. The reports described unpaid vendors, unpaid barbecue competition winners, problems with the carnival, a criminal investigation after complaints from businesses connected to the festival, and Andy and Jason both denied stealing money or committing crimes. And even after the festival ended, the story wasn't over. One lawsuit alleged copyright infringement over the festival logo. Another sought hundreds of thousands of dollars connected to sponsorship agreements. And then Atlanta Film Studios, they learned that one of its preferred vendors have reportedly lost around $15,000 because of the festival. According to reporting at the time, the studio, Atlanta Film Studios, immediately ended its relationship with Andy and Celeb Scene. That wasn't even all of it. One of the biggest sponsors of the festival was a company called Atlantic Beverage Company. Again, according to Fox 5, Atlanta Beverage Company had paid $300,000 to become the festival's exclusive official malt beverage and wine sponsor. $300,000. That's not a local business donating a few cases of beer. That is a major financial commitment. According to the reporting, the company believed it was sponsoring an event that would feature nationally known country music artists and draw massive crowds. And then something changed. About a week before the festival, Atlantic Beverage Company concluded that artists who had been promoted, which again was Alan Jackson, Miranda Lambert, Carrie Underwood, had never been signed to perform. And the company then demanded its money back and then later filed a suit describing the festival as an epic failure. Reading this and thinking about this, it wasn't the size of the event even. This wasn't even, and this definitely wasn't a disagreement over a few $100s. The lawsuit, and that was just one lawsuit. There was multiple lawsuits. This is just one lawsuit where just this one sponsor alone claimed it invested $300,000. And according to public reporting, they weren't the only ones who believed they had been left holding the bag. Fox 5 also reported the barbecue competition winners said they were never paid. So then the bands that actually performed said they never received payment. Again, the carnival company shut down after alleging not receiving payment. And a hotel in Carlton, again, I don't know how I'm saying this properly, reported more than $7,000 in unpaid charges after a debit card left for the performers was declined. By this point, we aren't looking at just one lawsuit anymore. It was a growing list of businesses. It wasn't just one unhappy customer. It was many. And some of these were big-time companies. And again, according to the public reporting, multiple lawsuits, multiple complaints, a criminal investigation stemming from what has been promoted just months earlier as one of the largest country music festivals Georgia's ever seen. So we went from this huge, amazing music festival to it being a complete disaster. I actually love the term that Atlantic Beverage Company used, an epic failure, because let's be real, it was an epic failure. And it has now led not only to lawsuits, but to a criminal investigation against Andy and Jason. When I started researching Heather's case, I thought I was just looking into a death. Just like I'm sure anybody else would when you start thinking about true crime. Yes, most documentaries spend some time talking about the person, but most of the focus is always on the death. Instead, I found years of history, as y'all have seen in the last 3 chapters now. We're only on chapter 3, and we are still only in 2015. Some of it did happen inside courtrooms. Some of it did involve the police, but some of it happened in everyday life. And some of it happened in places I never expected, like the music festival that we just talked about. We've met people whose lives became connected in ways they probably never imagined either. And none of these documents or people so far tell us what happened on May 4th of 2017. But they do something just as important. This is all very important context. And I'm sure some of you at this moment are wondering how. But I'm more sure that there are a lot of you that are going, holy crap. If all this happened and we're only in 2015, what happened even in just those last few months of 2017 before Heather's final day? And this is just a reminder that by the time investigators arrived at Heather's home, there was already a long history behind everybody involved. And again, to understand this case, we owe it to Heather to understand the history first. And that's why I'm really taking my time here. That's why we haven't skipped ahead, and that's why we did not start on May 4th of 2017. Because stories and people like Heather deserve more than a headline, and they deserve more than one episode, in my opinion. They deserve context and patience. Lots of patience. Mary and I have spent years at this point going through this case. Mary even more so than me. She has been dedicated to this case for 9 years. And there's no way to put 9 years worth of information into one 60-minute episode. So next time, we're finally going to step away from some of these court files and lawsuits, and we're going to spend time getting to know Andy and Heather. Their relationship, their marriage, the life they built together, the people who knew them, and the moments that in hindsight might help us better understand the years leading up to 2017. Because before she was a headline, she was a wife and a mother and a daughter and a friend. And that's the Heather I want you to know before we reach the day she died. I'm Rietta, and this is the Black File Project. Thank you for opening the file with me. I'll see you in the next chapter.